repository. Oh, the meeting's being recorded. And research data service at the University of Michigan Library, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's sessions. Today's presentations are the second in a series of 8 presentations hosted by the Michigan Institute for Data Science, or MIDAS, showcasing the work being done on research reproducibility issues at the University of Michigan. Each of these presentations was submitted as an entry in the MIDAS Reproducibility Challenge, which took place earlier this year. The series will run through the summer and culminate in a day-long summit on issues of reproducibility in research on September 14th, 2020. We're very much hoping that the MIDAS Reproducibility Day will be an in-person and interactive event. Please keep an eye out for more information throughout the summer. In developing the MIDAS Reproducibility Challenge, we sought to highlight the high-quality work on or relating to research reproducibility happening at the University of Michigan. And as in many emerging areas, there are multiple definitions for what constitutes research reproducibility. We adopted the broad definition provided by the National Academy's Committee on Reproducibility and Replicability in Science. They define computational reproducibility as obtaining consistent computational results using same input data, computational steps, methods, codes, and the conditions of analysis. Today, we'll hear 2 presentations. Our first presentation will be from Jake Fisher, research investigator at the Survey Research Center in the Institute for Social Research. In his presentation entitled Data-Specific Functions, Jake will describe a strategy for data collection efforts through distributing an open source set of tools for working with a particular data set. And I'll also show an example of how he's applied such a strategy in his work. Jake, go ahead.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Jake. Thanks for having me on. It's really a pleasure to get to present this for you. And I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's thoughts and questions about this project. Oh, I need to actually share screen with you. There we go. So as Jake mentioned, this project is looking at basically a strategy for designing functions to perform common recoding tasks with data. And so normally, I'm in the Survey Research Center. Unsurprisingly, do a lot of work with survey data. And to give you an idea of why I felt like this would be a valuable contribution, I think it helps to look at how survey data are typically distributed, both a good case and a bad case. So we're starting with a good case. Let's see if we can get this working. There we go. Starting with a good case, the American Time Use Survey is distributed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so when you go, they've got a whole website, they've got a ton of documentation for it. When you go on their website, you can click through the documentation and you can see that there's 7 to 10 different links to give you documentation. And if you click one of those links, like the data dictionary, you'll get a page. This is part of the page, but it'll be hundreds of links to PDF files. Most of the PDF files are about 60 to 70 pages long with about 5 appendices. So there's an awful lot of stuff to read when you first encounter a well-documented and excellent survey data resource. Now this is the best case scenario. A more typical case, I think, well, maybe not more typical case, but certainly a case when when individual investigators collect their own survey data and you're brought on as a graduate student, for example, you tend to encounter something like this. So this is screenshots of a box folder of a survey that I used extensively throughout grad school called the Prosper Survey. And so this was a longitudinal survey of students in schools. But as you can see, basically when you request access to these data, they give you access to the box. They basically make you an editor on the box folder, and they're like, good luck. And so there's, I think I counted 637 files in this folder. All of their names are totally incomprehensible. So we have ind main data with a bunch of mysterious dates. God knows what those are. We have group individual level characteristics. I think that's what that group ind-lev means. We've got hundreds of little network files in SAS and then also stored in different data formats. So it's just a hot mess. And looking at this, you might say, oh, hey, look, there's a folder that says Prosper Codebooks. But if you actually click on that folder, you'll see that there's 27 Word documents, all of which are kind of ill-documented, none of which actually cover the entire survey. including like 3 different Excel files for the different dates of the survey. And it's like, okay, I hope the last one is the most recent, but I'm not positive that it actually is. So I think this is actually somewhat common for survey documentation. And so I was trying to think of a better way to deal with this. And one of the guiding principles here in designing this is that I think if we're being honest with ourselves, lots of people have a tendency not to read documentation. So we remember this whenever we get a piece of IKEA furniture and we start trying to assemble it by hand, and then we're like, oh shoot, and then we go back and like to actually look at the documents, but we conveniently forget it when we're distributing data for other people. We hope that they will sit and spend like 5 days reading the entire documentation, when in fact they probably start working with the data and then ultimately go back and kind of fill in gaps in their knowledge with the documentation. Even with that documentation, there still tends to be a lot of tacit knowledge that kind of comes with the data. These are things that we don't necessarily put in the documentation, but that people who work with the data often know. So again, to take this example of students in the schools, one of the schools caught fire and burned down. And so people analyzing those data have a tendency to drop that school very consistent, like they almost always drop that school. But there's no way you would know that from any of the code books or any of the 637 files. You just have to know to drop that particular school. Or because it's a longitudinal survey of kids in schools, sometimes they get held back. And so you need to like, when you're merging data, you need to make sure that you merge on wave or an ID and cohort, because otherwise you'll get the same kid twice in 2 different waves or something like that. And this seems to crop up in virtually every data analysis example. Like, oh, if we reported on several people in the household, oh, we typically only use the main respondent. Like, if you're like trying to calculate wealth in a survey, like, oh yeah, there's like these 27 variables and we usually use so-and-so's code to do that. And basically, if you're not in the know, you would kind of be lost to do this. And so, one of the, this came about when I was reviewing a paper that had suggested constructing a table of metadata about the, like a regular expression parsable table of metadata about the survey file for the Fragile Families Challenge. And so it's like, basically instead of having a regular code book, they would have like something that you could write regular expressions to try and understand the actual survey. And at that point I was like, this is absurd. We have now reached, to take the XKCD panel on the right, we have now reached the point where we not only do we have a tool that needs a manual but doesn't have one, but we're actually at the point where we have a tool whose manual starts with how to use the manual. So I was like, we should move in the other direction and start distributing tools that actually just work, that don't really need the manual. And so the hope here was to be able to develop a set of functions that perform common tasks with the data. The goal, I was hoping to construct functions that are basically open source, so that someone who is new to the data can use them right away, but can also look back and say, did we keep these respondents? Did we drop these things? And actually look through it and make improvements. And the kind of the guiding principle here, which others may or may not agree with, is that the data should basically be left as is. So like once it's collected, it should be kind of stored and frozen, warts and all. So like all the different problems in it should be kept there, but we should have a consistent way of dealing with those problems so that it's always transparent. And so for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to go over a few, what I saw as a few likely use cases and some examples of these functions. The notion is that these should not necessarily be complicated. It's just a way of encoding all of our tacit knowledge in an immediate, easy to use format. And so that was kind of what I was hoping to do. So the main use cases I was going to go over are things like recoding and likely known data errors. So things like recodings are often in the code book, but people still have a tendency to miss them. Data errors are less likely to be in the documentation, for example. I was also going to cover subsetting criteria. So for example, when you need to know to drop the school that caught on fire, how would you include something like that? And merging criteria. So often data are distributed in multiple tables, which can be merged with each other. It's not always immediately obvious what columns they should be merged on and how well that match should be, how well that match should actually work. So ideally, we would construct a function that would be able to do that. There are a couple of other use cases that I included in the paper. One is commonly used summaries. Here I'm thinking of things like, this is how we constructed wealth. We use so-and-so's code, and we've kind of got a standard way of doing that. Those are actually fairly commonly in use now as it is. So like, I want to say it's HRS that's distributed with like code that somebody at RAND produced about how to calculate wealth. And so I'm going to leave those out for the sake of this. And I'll cover briefly this idea of language-specific constructs. So R in particular is kind of, there are a lot of different object types which are kind of necessary to do different analyses, particularly for network analysis, which is what I do a lot in R. So you might want potentially to be able to adapt your code directly to those. So use case number one was the types of common recodings. So on the left, we have the types of things that we were trying to fix, and on the right, we have some sample code for how this might be done. So again, these can be quite simple. So often, for example, 999 is like missing. Basically, what we would do is we would have a function that says remove missing that would make sure to change all the 999s to a software appropriate missing value. And this seems like a trivial example, but the American Sociological Review back in like the late 70s published an article where someone forgot to recode the 999s into missing values, and actually that skewed the entire analysis. So this is not like, it may seem trivial, but it's actually something that needs to be included. We basically want to make it idiot-proof to use the data. The other possible example was thinking of things like known errors. So, for example, in administrative data, we might someone might have used Excel to copy and paste, and Excel helpfully attempted to autocorrect some value to instead of being the same value across all the cells, it could autocorrect it to like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so ideally, you would construct something kind of like a load data function that would basically point to the file name and perform all of these recodings that you need to, that people who have that test knowledge would know to do, but people who are new to the data set might not already know. Similarly, I was thinking of kind of along the lines of a load data function for subsetting criteria. So again, like the school that catches on fire, or sometimes, often we have, or if we're looking at employees at a company, we might have employees on the one hand and contractors and temps on the other. Those might be, basically if all the cases aren't alike, we might want to have some ability to automatically drop cases that are not usually analyzed together. And so again, I was thinking of this in terms of like kind of a load data function where we basically pull in the data and then drop cases that are not the same, essentially. The third use case that I had considered for this was thinking of merge criteria. So again, often we get data sets that are in multiple tables that we want to bring together. The merge criteria ideally would indicate which column would automatically basically identify the correct columns for these things to merge on, and then would spit out a result that says basically we kept all the rows of this, X% of rows of this other thing matched into this. And so then you would be able to compare that against a value in the documentation and say like, okay, this is working correctly versus I have no idea. Like I got 60, like I tried to do this merge, 60% of it matched. Who knows if that's actually right? So these were the kinds of things, these are the types of things that I had been thinking of for this type of function. The last use case was a little bit more R specific. It's kind of thinking about basically if we want to construct a network object out of particular data sets, you might need some additional code for that, and you'd probably want to kind of standardize it. Bringing this all together, I wanted to show you an example from a published paper that uses these types of functions. So the notion here is that we basically have the data stored. This is the Prosper survey. This is the one with the 637 ill-documented files in a big box folder. And so basically what you'd want to be able to do is say you have a list of network objects in a rectangular survey data object. Ideally, you'd want to bring in pieces of information from the survey onto the network objects so that then you could do some kind of network analysis with those. And so I basically constructed a couple of examples here. So the first, these basically are two nested functions. So the first function is this get prosper variables by network. So you basically feed it a network object and the survey file, and what it does is it goes through and finds the IDs from the network object that correspond to the survey and pulls out the appropriate variables. And then with the second function, which calls that first function, can call that first function, get the set of variables, and then assign them as a network attribute, which is kind of an R-specific data construct, and then return that network for you to do analysis. So hopefully this seems plausible to you. When I brought it up to others, they presented a couple of concerns. So there are there's one set of concerns that's relatively easily addressed, and those are around replicability and the propagation of errors. So one possibility, so the idea here is that we would have these functions that are kind of edited by users as they go along. You know, like when one user builds a function, ideally it would be shared with everybody else. But then that presents the problem that if I write a paper in 2015 and someone discovers a data error in 2016, modifies the function in 2017, using the same function would not reproduce the code, would not reproduce the results from my paper in 2015, right? So that you can probably solve with a good versioning policy. So basically, when the code changes its output, like you would want to increment the versions, and people would need to cite the versions whenever they go to publish something using these functions. The second type of concern is a concern with the propagation of errors. So if a function actually produces an error and people use it uncritically, they could basically continue to produce all the same errors in subsequent papers. I would actually argue that that's an argument in favor of using a common set of functions, because frankly, right now we're already probably producing errors. It's just that they're more distributed. So, you know, some people are making the errors and some people aren't, and we have no idea. So if we have a shared function, basically we can correct that. We can find, you know, it's easier to find that one, the error in that one shared function, and then we can correct all the erroneous papers on MIDAS. And this actually did happen in a real world example. There's, I believe the fMRI, there was like a bug in the code to analyze fMRI data. And so there were like hundreds of papers that had an error because of this bug, but they were able to fix it you know, they were basically able to fix all of these papers en masse because they could fix this one central function. The other concerns that are less easily addressed are around cost and adoption. So basically it's kind of, you know, it's easy to look at this and say like, oh, this is a nice idea, but who's going to pay for it? And I think, you know, I don't have a clear answer about how to do this. The hope is that people will find it rewarding to, we'll be able to kind of structure the incentives so that people will find it rewarding to, more rewarding to improve these functions and use them than to just kind of develop their own thing. But it does help to think about what the incentives and the problems are that produce this in the first place. And part of the problem here is that social scientists are often rewarded for publishing papers, not code. And as a result, they make code writing pay by learning a data set. That means learning the tacit knowledge about how the data are used and writing the code to analyze those data to keep all of that tacit knowledge. It's kind of an opportunity hoarding problem, really. So one potential solution is to kind of structure this as like one of these, you know, kind of like a copyleft situation where, you know, have the data distributors produce the first set of functions, and then when someone else uses the functions, they're obligated to share any changes share the code that they used and any changes that they made with the functions back with the data distributors and everybody else using the data. But I'm very open to suggestions about how to make this work better. There are, of course, other barriers to how this, that basically are creating this problem in the first place. You know, funders may not want to pay for maintaining this kind of social science data infrastructure. you know, on long living projects, personnel and priorities may change. And of course, the technology and best practices change quite a bit over time. You know, even the code that I wrote 5 years ago that I was just showing you, I would probably have written differently today because there are different packages in R that are more standard now. And so all of these things are kind of areas where this could use some help thinking about how to basically get around some of these problems. I had thought that constructing this kind of living, breathing functions that kind of adapt with the technology over time, and as with the needs of the user base might be a good solution, but I'm very open to suggestions. So I don't know how we're doing on time, but that's kind of, I actually don't have any way of looking and seeing if anybody's raised their hand or anything. But yeah, I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, I think rather than trying to unmute people to ask their questions, if you could put your question in the chat room, and I will read it out to Jake on your behalf. So with that, are there any questions for Jake? Jake, I think I'll ask a question of my own.
Sure.
So I was intrigued in reading your paper that you talk really about the benefits that you've seen and the reasons why people should invest their time and energy into doing it in pretty compelling fashion. But then you also talk a bit about the costs that go along with it, and particularly, you know, the cost of time and benefit, given all the other work that faculty often have to do. But this is a decision that you've made and you're doing for your own particular work. And I think one of the things that's going to lead to a culture change is not just sort of the stick, you know, that you have to do this, but the carrots, and that you get benefits and results from having done so. So are there things that you needed in terms of support for developing this code and for investing your time in it? Are there things that the institution or funding agencies or others can do to make this an easier path to walk down, to reduce, you know, sort of the perception that you know, the amount of work it would take is being prohibitive?
Yeah, so I think so building these on my own for my own personal use, I found quite helpful, because then if I wanted to go back and do a quick analysis on the data, I didn't have to remember where like my data cleaning script was, or remember what the, you know, like create a cleaned version of the data set that I had to remember where it was. I could just like write, you know, load data, whatever, and it would run the appropriate file. So I found that was quite helpful. In terms of getting these more widely adopted, it would be very helpful to have like some formal mechanism for credit. So either like, you know, getting either having funding provided, or some kind of like citation mechanism, like either slapping a DOI on it or setting up a technical paper to go with it. That would have been helpful. And of course, it would be helpful to have everybody working on the project kind of invested. So like having leadership say, this is important, let's move towards doing this kind of thing, I think would be quite helpful. Actually, one of the things that's, so this actually came out of a workshop. The idea for this came out of a workshop called Software Engineering for Statisticians, which was a really cool idea, I thought, because we spend a lot of time writing code, and perhaps everyone else is very good at writing it, but I am not. So I thought it was really valuable to have people who do this for a living actually tell me what I was supposed to be doing right and wrong. And so, you know, I think that kind of having that kind of workshop would also be, I think, quite helpful.
Great, thanks. We have another question from one of our attendees. Jake, do you find Git functionality is sufficient for version control for such function sharing within the research community?
Yeah, I have struggled to get other people to adopt this, and I've actually struggled to get even Git installed in the enclaves where the data usually live. So in some sense, like in an abstract sense, yeah, I think Git would be fine. In a practical sense, I haven't had much luck getting other people to use it. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Okay, Lars, go ahead. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by Jake's notion of making more transparent, essentially, the data cleaning process of that. It's an open question, I think, Jake, about where to draw the boundary of where that happens. In the way that you've expounded it, these would be run essentially on user computers after they've obtained the raw data. And so there never exists a sort of well-designated clean data that you can access. Rather, that clean data gets redone in a replicable fashion on users' computers. But a different way of looking at that, and possibly abstracting from some of the issues about what software you want to implement that in, is to delegate that here's the best practice, here's the function that generated that best practice onto the data provider's data extraction tool or whatever, which are often quite proprietary, sometimes opaque about those data cleanings. That's the initiator. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that function needs to be devolved to the users. It can be just exposed and implemented in open tools at the data providers. So here's the raw data, here's our extract. Most people will use the clean extract because, hey, I trust you guys. But if you want to look into it, you can also redo it and modulate and figure out and identify bugs, et cetera, in that. So it might just as well be that this is easier to implement in a centralized fashion, but with much greater transparency. Have you come across that as well?
I think that's a great point. So yeah, to put this in perspective, I was developing this as a graduate student, and as a graduate student, you don't really have the power to kind of say, like, I'm going to distribute the data in such and such a way. But I think if you were a data provider, that would be a good way of handling this problem. Basically saying, I think you're right that it's a good question where we'd want to draw the line. So there's some, you could imagine that there are some decisions that researchers would likely want to make on their own, levels of aggregation or what have you. But there are some decisions that researchers probably shouldn't be making, like cleaning up known data errors is something that, like 99% of people shouldn't be doing. And so I think you're right that it might be a lot easier to kind of push that off onto the people doing the distribution. Yeah.
Just one quick question, Jake. You mentioned that other barriers present problems, including funders may not want to pay for maintaining social science data infrastructure.
Yeah.
Have you looked into existing social science infrastructure, including data repositories, and looking at using existing functionality or asking them to add functionality to support this?
So I have not made. So yeah, it's actually kind of funny presenting this with the ICPSR, which is one of the best data infrastructures in the world. So it's, like this is, I'm thinking of like, your typical, you've got 5 investigators putting everything in a box folder, versus like ICPSR, which actually does this professionally. But yeah, no, there's a limit to how much I've dug into like professional data infrastructures adoption of this. Yeah.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our second presentation. Our second presentation will be led by Jared Lyle, an archivist at ICPSR. Jared will be joined by Lars Vilhuber, the Executive Director of the Labor Dynamics Institute at Cornell University, Maggie Levenstein, the Director of ICPSR, and Chelsea Goforth, a Data Project Manager at ICPSR. Jared and his co-presenters will be presenting on the developing the American Economic Association's data and code repository at Open ICPSR, and how ICPSR is assisting the AEA in enacting and operationalizing its recently adopted data and code availability policy.
Great,
Jared,
thanks.
go ahead.
Thanks, Jake. I'm actually going to turn it to Maggie Levenstein, Dr. Maggie Levenstein, who's the director at ICPSR, to start the presentation. Maggie.
Thank you, Jared. So I think you're controlling the slides, yes? So yes, so I just want to give a little bit of motivation for the project that we're going to talk about today. ICPSR has for almost 60 years been committed to openness and access to data. And reproducibility is one goal of that access, though obviously the kinds of issues that Jake was talking about are also things that the sort of the identification and not reproduction of errors is another one. In the terms of this particular project, I would say it has actually two different origins. One is that the American Economic Association adopted in 2005, so very early on, a data sharing policy, which was, and in doing so, it was really a leader in its field in facilitating reproducibility, trying to address challenges that had been made to the research produced by the AEA, saying that it was impossible for people to reproduce the results that were published in its journals, that it was impossible to sort of see how sensitive they were to changes in specification or changes in the data. And so in 2005, in response to this, it adopted a policy requiring that all empirical articles share the data and a code associated with those articles. And it included, as was, was a leading and best practice at the time, it included those as sort of supplementary materials on its website. This was no question about it, an enormous advance for social sciences, and was really a model at the time. It did not, however, solve all of the problems with reproducibility. So in 2013, quite famously, there was a paper published by Herndon, Ash, and Poland that identified errors in a very prominent and influential work by Reinhardt and Rogoff. And those errors were literally problems in their Excel spreadsheets, but that were only identified later, of course, when the data are made available. In 2016, articles published in Science indicated that, found that quite a few of the results, again, the data were available because of the AEA data sharing policy, but that the analyses particularly from from randomized controlled trials were not reproducible. So there was continuing concern on the part of the AEA. The policy that it adopted in 2005 was not sufficient. There was another concern, which was also that a lot of the data that researchers were increasingly using in economic analyses were either proprietary or confidential or restricted, and so that a large fraction of authors were saying that they couldn't possibly share their data because of restrictions on making it available to another party. Over this same period, Open ICPSR, which had long been sharing data, began in the around 2012, initiated a series of discussions among editors of social science journals and working with people in federal statistical agencies and federal data policy groups, supported the Office of Science and Technology policy memo. And in response to all of this sort of activity and discussions that ICPSR was engaged in with different stakeholders in the social science field, Open ICPSR created what we call Open ICPSR, which really is a repository for data extracts that are used in research articles. And we have since established relationships with other associations, including the Economic History Association and the American Education Research Association, both of which really wanted people to, again, make their data available for reproducibility, for training purposes, in order to provide transparency to the research that was going on. And then, I guess last year or the year before, the AEA, sort of as beefing up its policy, decided that it also wanted to make its data available and the code available through Open ICPSR, so in a more with better preservation and better findability, but also really as a result of the leadership of Lars Vilhuber, the AEA's new data editor, decided that it was actually going to undertake efforts to attempt to reproduce analyses prior to their research. And so that collaboration between two organizations which have been working on this for a couple decades really what culminated in this project. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lars to tell you more about the things that he's been doing, and then Jared and Chelsea can tell you about ICPSR's role. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie.
And thanks to MIDAS for the challenge. It's a great effort to bring attention to reproducibility, and it's particularly in data science where it's so important.
Yeah. Thank you, Maggie, and thank you, Jacob, for having us go through what we have here. So Maggie laid out the history of this, and in early 2017, I was appointed, early 2018, I was appointed to the data editor position, essentially with the idea, hey, we're not exactly certain what we're going to do, but make it better. And so my vision for this was, let's first make it a lot better, and then make the position of a data editor who has to enforce it become at some point in time obsolete. One can entertain fantasies, whether that will, I'll achieve that goal in my lifetime because people just incorporate reproducible practices in what they do is an open question, but one can hope. I'm going to spend most of this on how we actually do this, but Maggie pointed out this goes beyond simply dumping materials onto journal websites or ICPSR, which is no guarantee for actual computational reproducibility, as Jacob helpfully defined early on in this process. It is only the idea that you can deposit materials there and then not rely on authors' goodwill to find those bugs. And Jake had examples of why we care about those bugs. The data cleaning, every social science article has some element of data cleaning, even after the data providers have done that, etc. There's a lot of things going on there. In some preliminary work that we did several years ago, we were looking at the posted materials as they were on the journal's website. And most often, the other point that Jake pointed out earlier about most social scientists are poor programmers. I usually choose a much meatier term for that. Our notion from that was, fundamentally, there doesn't seem to be a very big problem, but we're very far away from push button reproducibility because there's lots of bugs, lots of small things that are missed because this is just a tail end process that happens somewhere along the line. So incomplete materials, non-functional code, missing dependencies, all those kinds of things are issues that we found. So we set out to not only move to ICPSR as a way to make more transparent and better curated the materials that we collect, but in doing so, before we put them out there as the version of record, we're also going to try and scale up massively our attempts to reproduce prior to publication of the article, the materials that go along with it. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. Jared, next slide. So the required outcomes that we're looking for here are, first of all, and this is where ICPSR plays a really good role, archival record of the scholar's materials, including versioning of those materials. So suppose that we didn't catch a particular error or something like that. There needs to be a mechanism for post-publication updates to that to correct the record, yet maintain the transparency of what was there when it was published and what was corrected afterwards. So the versioning that's implicit in properly curated materials is critical to this. This was not something that normally happens on journal websites when you dump a zip file out there, etc. We also wanted a permanent identifier for these attributes in compliance with all the data citation principles and all that stuff. These are part of the scholarly record and they need a permanent identifier. Now, one could have done that at the journal, but that would have meant putting in place an infrastructure in addition to everything that was going on in terms of the manuscripts. It comes automatically with something like a trusted repository. We wanted linkages to and from the article. Jake highlighted the fact that most researchers don't get credit for either creating data or code, but we wanted to at least initiate that conversation to be able to measure what are the materials that are associated with it. The other part was that we do, while our primary repository is at OpenICPSR, we do entertain deposits at other trusted repositories because we'd actually like this to happen much earlier in the research cycle. Ideally, you've got a proper repository before you go to any journal, and then I don't want you to come back and plunk the stuff that you already have archived on Dataverse or Zenodo or somewhere else, or even somewhere on OpenICPSR and make another copy of it. I don't want that. I want to reference that other copy. So linkages both ways and putting those into the metadata infrastructure at Crossref and DataCite was important to me. we wanted something that would allow us to also inspect the materials before downloading. You want to be able to do partial downloads because maybe you don't want to do all the data prep. The analysis files are there. You just want to run the 5-hour job that runs the analysis files, not the 3-week job that prepares all the data files that requires a ton of other stuff. So we wanted that kind of transparency. And we wanted a proper identification of roles of who's doing what in this process, the author, the distributor, the publisher. And we're starting to see some of that where we get back non-trivial questions about who's the author of the data deposit who might not be the same as the authors of the actual article. 99.9% it's the same, but we have found some cases where people said, yep, I didn't participate in data stuff. That's Joe and Blake, and they're going to be the authors, and I'm not on that list. Jared, next slide. So some of the desired attributes, which is a work in progress, are issues that affect how scalable this becomes from a journal perspective. Journal workflow integration is definitely a work in progress. We're making huge strides on that, but that's typical for the overall industry of journal publications and data curation at this point. There really is, if you want to be open, such as we are to other repositories, there really is no easy solution right now to integrate this smoothly into journal workflows. We need pre-publication access for replicators. I do think that you get much better compliance if you don't throw all the bugs out into the open, so that we can download some of the materials beforehand and not. That's one of the key features of working with ICPSR on this that we appreciated, because that doesn't come automatically when you're using other repositories simply as here's already an archive out there. Now we need to correct it because we found a problem, etc. Role-based access and partial automation are all still works in progress, and there are a lot of repeated tasks. I'll show you the system that we've cobbled together to some extent to make all these things stick. There's a lot of scope for automating some stuff, including automated checks of the reproducibility. In theory, you have a master script. You would have a computer program that identifies that single master script that runs from A to Z through the entire analysis, and you can compare the output of that in a machine-readable form. You could do a lot of these checks in an automated fashion. We are nowhere close to that, because even when we have a master script that runs through things, the output is not necessarily well identified or machine readable, or is there any common standard to do this? So humans are still a very important feature of this reproducibility aspect. Okay, Jared? So from a user perspective, they don't care about a lot of the plumbing in the background. They're already going to be somewhat confused by the fact that they're going to submit their materials to Manuscript Central, which is what the AEA uses, plunk in any other manuscript management system into this, and they're going to now be asked to deposit their materials at Open ICPSR in a branded data repository that Jared and Chelsea will describe afterwards. And at the end, they will want to see their article published on the AE website. This is where you can download the PDFs and stuff like that. And there's a link that points then to the Open ICPSR repository where their materials end up being. So there's not yet an integrated view onto this that might be ideal, but at least there's two versions of that. And you need to be able to get back and forth between those two versions. That's where those linkages are critical. Jared? On the back end, I need to tie those things together, because at the journal level, I'm going to be tasked out with, hey, here's some materials, please verify whether they're good. Then there's this whole data editor process, and I send back to the editor something that says, yep, this is fine, or no, this needs a bit of work. There's a couple of revisions that need to be done. At the AA, we do this. We introduced a conditional accept mode that we didn't use to have. Other journals have this. So that we now get access to the materials prior to a formal final acceptance. But in doing so, we're also slowing down the publication process, because copy editing and layouting and all that kind of things only happen when something is definitively accepted. And so we need to insert ourselves into that process in the most efficient way. Jared? So blowing out what that data editor process means is that we're technically using Jira here as one of the task management systems. You can plunk in anything else you want here. Our internal processes themselves need to be reproducible, because we're going to get revisions, and we need to figure out, again, when we get revisions, what has changed, what do we need to do. The RA has moved on in the meantime. Somebody else needs to run this. We need reproducibility for scalability here internally. We use Bitbucket for that. We use Open ICPSR as both our final publication mechanism as well as the mechanism by which authors provide us with their materials, but we need to compute somewhere as well. Here's where we leverage the fact that we are at a university, so we have our University Computer Center that the students need to be trained on. That's called CISR at Cornell. We have an internal resources, so we do on a regular basis call in outside experts. That might be some graduate student in the department who's an expert on that, but it might also be somebody who has access to the data somewhere in Norway and can run some code for us, etc. And I'll get back to some of those examples. And we need to get to secure data, some other Dataverse and Zenodo aspects, etc. JIRA ties it all together. So we're looking at various systems here. Our internal identifier is the JIRA identifier. We have a manuscript identifier. We have an open ICPSR deposit number. And if that happens, and we have a direct link to the deposit if it's not on open ICPSR, so that the RA who will see this aspect can pull all these things together. He has to read the manuscript and he has to tie it back to the data. And at some point in time, I need to revise a report and go back to the journal. So this ties it all together. Jared? So what are the tasks that my team here does? There's two relatively distinct set of tasks. The first one is focused on metadata. So the RAs go through and list out all the data sets that an author is using. Now that might seem simple, and in most of the discussion in the reproducibility world, it's like a paper has one data input, it processes it, produces tables, it's a very linear thing, etc. We have economics papers who use 30 different data sets, and they might be well documented, they might not be well listed. There might be one that just happens to show up in some footnote on table 15 or something like that. It's sometimes a really hard process for the RAs to collect all that information because, again, there's no current template on how to do that. We enforce data citations. That's not actually something new, but it's something that for the previous decade had been mostly ignored. And so we ask authors now to provide data citations, and the RAs, once they know what the data sets are that are being used, are going to check, are they also being cited? We check data availability statements. Open access data is you can simply click on it and download, but that's not the norm. Even on some issues, like if you're using an ICPSR data set, you actually have to register, you have to agree to comply with all the rules. You might need to apply to confidential data. That's the data availability statement. And those are not always very clear. Sometimes you access the OECD database and you have to type in some search words, and you can't reference the output of that. You have to describe the process of doing that. That's a data availability statement, and we check that we can actually figure out where the data comes from. And that goes to Jake's point, is that this is about the raw data, and at some point in time, you're going to post-process that, and we also want the code to be complete. That's on the other panel there. And then we check metadata on open ICPSR. Is our authors there, our keywords there, and stuff like that. And we check the structure. Do we have a proper structure set up? Is there a README file that somebody can read, and all those kinds of things. We then actually download the code and the data to the extent that we can, and in most cases we can actually. We assess code completeness. So do we have everything? Do we have the code that goes from the raw data to the analysis data? Do we have a code that goes from all analysis data to every single figure and table in the paper? Right? Some authors provide us with some neat tables. Other times we have to go through the code and figure that stuff out. At this point, we haven't even run it yet. Only then do we actually run it. So up until assessing the completeness of the code, we need no access to the data. This is done for every single deposit, regardless of how confidential the data might be. And then if we have the data, we run the code and compare the results. The RA then writes a report. I review those reports and approve it, and then it's submitted back into the manuscript central system. That process can take anywhere from 5 hours to 3 weeks, depending on how complex these things might be. And there's a lot of things out there. So metadata, we try and properly populate as much as we can. The key issue is that you tell a social scientist to fill out the metadata, and they will say, what's metadata? And so a lot of these things are going to be, what is it that you actually want? Why do you want it, etc. There are some things we don't discuss. You have to provide them, otherwise you're not going forward. But other things can't be required. Geographic coverage is really important if you're running a survey and is completely irrelevant if you're running an experiment. And so even some of these elements are not necessarily always going to apply to every single data set, right? And as it turns out, most social scientists don't keep track. What is actually my unit of observation? What is the proper universe for doing these things? And so those are just things where we are lenient about enforcing some of these metadata elements. They should be better documented. That would make for better science, but so far they're suggestive because otherwise we'd get hung up here for a very long time. Jared? When I said structure, I mentioned the README, but I also mentioned zip files. We actually want transparency in seeing what the materials are, and up to some technological limits. If you have 15,000 data files in your replication package, we may want to zip a few of those up because that's a bit too much. But we don't want random empty directories, random zip files sitting around that just say, here's my replication stuff, figure it out. So we want those exploded out so you can peruse the system and have it just look at it and say, oh yeah, I recognize that file or that code, I want to have a look at it, and just download that one piece. For reproducibility, for reusability, that's key. Jared? So what do my RAs need in terms of skills? They need non-trivial skills that we actually have to train them on when we get them, because we get mostly, I try to do this mostly with undergraduates in the social sciences, but also computer science, statistics, engineering. We typically get applicants who are in their junior year. Some sophomores are there as well. Sophomores are great because once you train them, they actually like the job. They stay with you for at least 2 years. And we give them a very intensive start session, a boot camp, and then it takes 5 to 7 weeks to get them into that mode where they can both understand our systems and understand what they need to do, because this is not taught at that level on average in most universities. At least at our university it's not. So we have to actually teach them this stuff. What do they need to do? They need to read documents and understand where the author is describing what data they're using. If that were standardized, it would be a lot easier. If there were a checklist, it would be a lot easier. That's not how we write articles, right? They need to be able to run code in minimally invasive mode. That means as it comes out of the box, there are some small changes that we all have to make. And we're helped by that most economists write in 2 languages, Stata or MATLAB. Forget about R, Python, etc. Those are small fractions of the overall population. So we can train them on Stata and MATLAB, and we've got 95% of the stuff covered. But that doesn't mean that running Joe's Stata program versus Brandon's Stata program, those are going to be quite different ways of running it. There are so many ways you can do that. So we have to train them on being a bit flexible. This is computational reproducibility. So all we do is that the code runs, it spits out a table, and that is the same table as in the paper. We do not second guess whether those methods are right. They only reliably reproduce the numbers that are there, but you can then inspect the code as a researcher and say, no, they did this wrong. I want to do this again. I want to just change that one thing. And we can guarantee, well, you don't have to debug the whole thing. You can run it as is and just modify your line. So this goes to Jake's point earlier about this is really key to have all of that exposed and reusable. Jared?
Just one thing, Lars. I think we have 5 minutes left in the presentation. Is that right, Jake? Okay.
Okay, so the scale of this is that we have right now about 800 done assessments for 8 journals. Current state is I've got about 20 RAs, but there's a lot of flux. And we do reproducibility checks with confidential data. And then we can talk about the rest, I think, in later on some of the challenges. So I'll hand over to you, Jared, at this point.
All right, Chelsea, do you want to?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Lars. So Jared and I are going to end the presentation today with a quick walkthrough of an AEA project workspace on OpenICPSR and the resulting publish page to provide some visuals for many of the elements that Lars just mentioned. So depositors initiate the deposit of data collection by starting with the Create New Project modal. Next slide, yeah, thank you. And this button is where they enter in a project title and select the AEA repository from the list of repository options. The OpenICPSR identifying number that Lars mentioned is created right away here in this initial step. They then proceed to the project workspace, where the majority of the project work and documentation occurs. And so the next few slides will take us through each of these sections that I've highlighted here one by one. The first section that you saw at the top, that's where users can select to either upload files individually or import from zip. And this slide here shows a glance at what one of those modals looks like. Below that, OpenICPSR offers options for many descriptive metadata fields, some of which, like that for a principal investigator here, they're used to construct the project citation. You'll note from a few of these screenshots that there's a wide variety of metadata field types. So they range from longer free-form entry for fields like the project summary. I think that's on the next slide. Is that right, Jared? There we go. Project summary here, date formats in other cases, and more fixed choice formats for fields like collection mode. We won't go through all of them here, but you can see the range. Those descriptive metadata include some customized fields for the AEA repository specifically, like JEL codes and manuscript number. And taken together, this all increases the discoverability of the AEA projects on OpenICPSR. In addition, depositors and/or administrators can add related publications in order to link the data collection back to the published article. And depositors and administrators can also use the project communication log on the next slide, thanks, at the bottom of the workspace for back and forth communication about the data collection to further facilitate the workflow that Lars outlined. Lastly, the project administration tools that we previously saw on the right side of the project workspace can further facilitate various workflows and collaboration by allowing the depositor to share the project, as in this modal here, with any or all of their collaborators. And then the next slide is will show the view log, and this documents all actions that are taken on a project in case there are any questions or confusion. Once the depositor has finished uploading their data collection and editing their project, then it's time to publish. And so once they click on the publish button, the depositor will first see a screen where they can review their project one more time. And then they're routed to this page here, the terms and conditions page, where they are asked to answer some questions about disclosure risk, to select a license, and to agree to the ICPSR terms of deposit. Jared will pick back up then with the published project. Go ahead, Jared.
Thanks, Chelsea. So once the project is published, then what you see here is what's on the main website. Users can access the data. They can view the metadata that was completed by the depositor. There are usage statistics. There's an ability to download the data. And then there's a citation. And by citation, it includes credit for whomever was the principal investigator or the author of the data. It includes the year it was published. And there's a DOI, that's that persistent identifier reference that people can use, and it goes directly back to that project homepage. There's the additional published metadata about the project. There are the versions on the right-hand side, and then the related publications linked to each project. Just a few closing things, sneak peek into new workflows we're building for these journal repositories. This will allow for depositors to submit directly to AEA before it's published. A depositor can recall a submission, resubmit, or create a new version of their project. This then gets submitted to AEA, and they're able to review the deposit and change the status of it. So they can send the deposit back, put notes in about what corrections are needed, and then they can also reject or publish the project. So this new workflow allows the AEA or other journals or professional associations to directly review and submit back and forth the projects before they're published and available on the sites. So we thank MIDAS again for this opportunity, and I know we're at 1 minute past the hour, so I'll turn it back to Jake.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, we are a little beyond the hour, but I do want to give the opportunity to ask questions if there are any. And again, please type them in the chat window. So while we're waiting for folks to type in the question, I have a question of my own, probably mostly for Lars. So first of all, kudos to the AEA for really taking this on and not just promoting reproducibility as a value, but taking steps to build structure and mechanisms to actually make it happen. My question is, what kind of reception has this gotten or continues to get in the folks who publish in AEA journals? Are you seeing a lot of acceptance or some pushback, particularly given the amount of time that may need to be invested in making all of this happen?
Well, that's hard to answer. First of all, the people I interact with, I'm the last hurdle to go before they get to publish in one of the most prestigious journals in economics, so they don't complain too much. Around the back end, I have gotten the occasional complaints about being too picky and things like that. I have no idea whether that's widespread or whether that's justified. That's not random sampling at all. That's just pointing out that somebody did have bad data publication practices and I corrected them. I also very often, but again, not randomly selected, get appreciation expressed for having helped people make their code and their analysis better. So you get the full spectrum. That's to be expected. We are trying to change people's habits and people don't necessarily like their habits being changed. So there is a bit of an experiment going on there as well. But in general, I would say there has been no notion at all among the editors that this is a bad idea. We're trying to improve its efficiency. We're trying not to delay papers, and we are creating new delays. And I do get occasional concerns about that. So far, we've always been able to address that. So I think at present, we have not de facto generated delays to publication for any given paper. But we have created perceived delays because we've inserted a new mechanism into that sometimes takes a bit more time. We're working with undergraduates. That is by design. It makes it more affordable to the journal than potentially. I don't know, that remains to be assessed. It's also an educational outreach, but undergraduates do have occasional other things on their minds. Sometimes it's because they have a midterm, and sometimes it's because they get chucked out of their dormitories because of COVID-19 or things like that. Working with an undergraduate workforce is highly variable and causes all manner of gray hair to be added to mine. So,
yeah, as the father of an undergraduate myself, I can certainly understand that.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Oh, wait. Nope. I'm sorry. I'm not seeing anything come through. So I'd like to thank all our presenters today and to MIDAS for hosting this. As I mentioned, this is a part of a series. The next presentation in this series will take place on June 23rd from 2 to 3 p.m. And that'll be with Oliver Hay, who's an associate professor of microbiology and immunology at the University of Michigan, and Jie Song, a graduate student research assistant at ICPSR at the University of Michigan. And they'll present their work entitled C2 Metadata, Continuous Capture of Metadata for Statistical Data. So thank you all very much, and that'll do it for us.
Thank you for having us.
Yep. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.